Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Hargrove called her when she questioned his post-op protocol in front of the entire surgical staff. He didn't know that the woman standing 3 feet away with her hands folded had kept a 240-pound green beret alive for 40 hours under mortar fire in Sanjin Valley with nothing but a field pack and muscle memory. He had no idea that the infection rates climbing in his ICU matched a documented pattern she'd seen before, a pattern that had a solution, one that lived in her body the way other people's knowledge lived in textbooks. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. Sacred Heart Hospital spreads across a San Diego hillside like a sleeping giant, its emergency bays and trauma centers pumping with the rhythmic urgency of a 24-hour organism. At 0200 hours on a Tuesday, the night shift moves through corridors bathed in fluorescent white that makes everything look slightly unreal. The ICU smells like antiseptic and the particular staleness of recirculated air, a smell that never quite disappears, no matter how many times the HVAC system cycles. Sarah Chen knows every corner of these halls. She has walked them for 3 years, moving with the kind of efficient precision that comes from understanding exactly where every piece belongs and why it matters. The night shift is quieter than day rounds, but not peaceful. Monitors hum their electronic lullabies. Ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythms. Somewhere down the corridor, a patient is crying softly, the sound cutting through layers of white noise and bad fluorescent lighting. Sarah pauses at a bedside, checking the central line placement on a post-op abdominal surgery patient, her eyes tracking the drainage bag with the focused attention of someone who reads data the way other people read faces. The fluid is amber-tinged, slightly thicker than it should be. She makes a note, 0215 hours, increased serous drainage, patient afebrile, white count trending up. The numbers tell a story. She's learned to listen. Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrives for his night rounds at 0230, expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum tiles like a clock counting down to something nobody wants to happen. He's tall in the way men are when they've never been told no, with silver threading through dark hair that photographs well. His presence has a particular quality, the kind of gravitational pull that makes the air pressure change. He moves through the ICU as though the rooms themselves are subordinate to his authority, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a ceremonial object rather than a tool. Behind him trails 2 residents who move slightly faster than necessary, eager to stay within his orbit. Sarah stands at the bedside of room for 12, reviewing the chart on the wall-mounted computer. She's dressed in standard navy scrubs, her hair pulled back in a braid so tight it looks painful, her face the kind of blank slate that comes from years of making herself invisible in rooms that weren't designed to see her. On her wrist is a single piece of tape, medical tape, blue and worn, with a time check written in fading marker, 0115. It's a habit from somewhere she doesn't talk about. From somewhere her fingertips are registered in federal databases that don't officially exist. Hargrove enters room for 12 without knocking. The patient, a 67-year-old male recovering from a sigmoid colectomy performed 36 hours earlier, stirs slightly. Hargrove performs his examination with the kind of distracted competence that suggests he's done this 5,000 times and will do it 5,000 more without learning anything new. He checks the surgical site, reviews the monitor readings, nods at something the senior resident whispers. His eyes pass over Sarah once, the way eyes pass over furniture. She's part of the room's infrastructure. Noticed and dismissed in a single glance. Drainage? Hargrove asks, not to Sarah, but to the younger male resident standing closer to him, a man who has never had to make himself smaller than the room required. Sarah speaks anyway, her voice the kind of quiet that doesn't demand attention but somehow still gets it. Post-op day 2. Increased serous output starting at 0145. Amber tinged. Patient afebrile, but white counts trending upward. 11 point for last draw. Hargrove doesn't acknowledge that she's spoken. He glances at the monitor, reads the numbers himself as though she hasn't just given them to him, and then he's moving out of the room, his residents trailing behind him like planets orbiting a star that hasn't noticed they're there. The senior resident, a man named Chen with no relation to Sarah, a fact that has created an ongoing and painful irony, whispers something to Hargrove about the patient's age and comorbidities. Hargrove nods. They don't discuss Sarah's observation about the infection pattern. She makes another note anyway. She's learned that documentation matters. Everything matters when you're the only one who sees it. The rest of the night shift unfolds in the particular rhythm of hospital darkness. Sarah moves from room to room, checking lines and dressing changes, monitoring patients whose names she knows and whose families she never meets. She's good at this work, better than good, the kind of good that manifests in patients who recover slightly faster than the literature suggests they should, in complications that are caught at 0215 instead of caught at 0600 when the day shift arrives. But that kind of invisible excellence doesn't earn promotions. It doesn't earn mentions in staff meetings. It earns the privilege of moving through hallways unnoticed, which, Sarah has learned, is sometimes the only safety available. At 0430, Sarah is in the break room doing something she rarely does, sitting down. There's stale coffee in a carafe that someone made at midnight, and a single donut on a plate that nobody's claimed because it's been there since yesterday. She's checking her phone, which is an old iPhone 6 with a cracked screen that she keeps in her locker underneath her jacket. The jacket has something sewn inside the lining that she never talks about, something with faded thread that's been hand-stitched by someone's careful fingers. A patch. A symbol. Proof of a life that ended 3 years ago when she disappeared into the identity of Sarah Chen, RN, with social security paperwork that's completely real and completely fabricated, depending on which databases you're checking. The phone buzzes. A number she's never seen before. She doesn't answer. She'll check it later, in her car, the way she checks everything now. Discipline. Compartmentalization. The muscle memory of being nobody. When Sarah returns to the ICU at 0445, something has shifted. An army medic named Thompson, recovering from a knee reconstruction in room 307, is awake and restless. He's been hospitalized for 4 days, and this is his first night shift where he's alert enough to notice the way the nurses move, the way they actually listen to their patients instead of just checking boxes on forms. He watched Sarah at 0200 when she helped a resident manager difficult line placement on an elderly post-op patient 3 rooms down. He watched her hands move with the kind of precision that doesn't come from a nursing school textbook. Combat surgery methodology. That's what he's recognizing, though he doesn't have words for it yet. He saw it in Kandahar. He saw it in field hospitals under incoming fire. He saw it in the hands of a Navy corpsman named Chen who kept an entire squad alive during a 40-hour siege in Sanjin Valley, someone who moved like the worst situations had already happened to her and this was just background noise. Someone who could suture under pressure the way other people could breathe. Sarah doesn't notice him noticing. She's in room 307 at 0510, checking his pain levels, adjusting his for fluids with the kind of attentive care that suggests she actually believes his recovery matters. She asks him about his breathing, his leg pain, whether he's sleeping. She listens to the answers. She doesn't check her watch. Thompson watches her hands. Steady. Scarred. The kind of hands that have held things together when everything was trying to fall apart. Hargrove arrives early for day rounds at 0545, earlier than usual, which means he has somewhere important to be, which means he's in a particular kind of mood. He moves through the ICU with the air of a man who's made a decision about something and is about to act on it. He stops in room 307 to check on Thompson's knee reconstruction, performs the standard exam, nods at Thompson's responses. Thompson, who's awake and watching, mentioned something casually about the night shift nurse, Sarah, and how her technique reminded him of someone he knew from overseas. Hargrove's head tilts slightly. A predator registering something unusual in its territory. He doesn't say anything. But he looks back toward the ICU, toward where Sarah is charting at the nursing station, visible through the window glass. His eyes narrow. A calculation starts. A puzzle piece that doesn't fit with the other pieces. A night shift nurse who knows things about infection patterns from field hospitals. Who has hands that move like they've done this under conditions that hospitals don't simulate? Who exists in their staff roster with perfect credentials and zero history before 3 years ago? Something doesn't add up. But that's a thought for later. Right now, Hargrove has a morning to manage, rounds to complete, a department to run. He files it away, the medic's recognition, the unusual precision, the girl who speaks so quietly nobody remembers what she said. Filed away like a case he'll revisit. Like a thread he might pull. He has no idea what unravels when you pull the right thread. Sarah finishes her shift at 0700, hands off her patients to the day shift nurse with meticulous detail, every note, every observation, every subtle trend that might matter in 6 hours. The day shift nurse nods and doesn't listen, the way day shift never listens to night shift because day shift assumes night shift is just coasting through darkness, missing things, doing the minimum. The day shift nurse will, in fact, miss the early signs of the infection in room for 12 until it becomes obvious at 1400, which is 8 hours later than Sarah saw it coming. But that's not Sarah's problem anymore. She clocks out. She moves through the parking garage of Sacred Heart Hospital toward her car, a 2009 Civic that runs with the kind of quiet efficiency of a vehicle that's been maintained by someone who understands that reliable transportation is sometimes the only lifeline available. She drives toward her apartment in Ocean Beach, a small one-bedroom with a view of nothing important, where she keeps the minimal furniture of someone who's prepared to leave at any moment. She doesn't know yet that Hargrove is already making calls. That he's already ordered Thompson's medical records pulled, searching for connections, wondering about nurses who appear suddenly in staff rosters. She doesn't know that the puzzle piece he's noticed is going to start him down a path that will unravel everything, her carefully constructed identity, her 3 years of invisibility, her solitary existence in a city that doesn't know who she actually is. The helicopter is still months away. The Green Beret colonel hasn't crashed yet. But the wheels are turning, the dominoes are beginning their subtle shift toward collapse. All because a man in expensive shoes decided to notice something he shouldn't have noticed. All because a nurse moved her hands like she'd been trained for something nobody was supposed to be trained for. All because sometimes the truth, once glimpsed, becomes impossible to unsee. The staff lounge at Sacred Heart Hospital smells like burnt coffee and institutional desperation at 7 in the morning. Sarah stands before the assembled cluster of doctors and nurses gathered for shift change, holding a folder that feels heavier than paper should weigh. Her scrubs are wrinkled from the 12-hour night shift, but her voice is steady as she speaks about the ICU infection rates, 3 patients in the last 2 weeks with post-operative sepsis, all following the same surgical protocol, all preventable if the post-op environment protocols adjusted for high-stress patient loads. She cites field data, outcomes from extended care scenarios, something about infection control in austere environments that makes the attending physicians shift their weight uncomfortably because they don't recognize the framework she's referencing. The words sound medical, sound credible, but they don't come from any nursing textbook anyone in this room has ever read. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stands near the sink, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. His expression shifts from mild interest to something sharper, something that looks like a predator recognizing movement in tall grass. He sets the cup down slowly. When he speaks, his voice drips with the kind of condescension that only comes from absolute institutional certainty. And where exactly did Nurse Chen get her epidemiology degree? Let me guess, WEBMD. Laughter ripples through the room like a contagion, the kind of reflexive social compliance that happens when a man with authority makes a cruel joke first. Sarah doesn't flinch. Doesn't blink. The folder in her hands doesn't tremble. Hargrove leans against the counter, addressing the crowd now, turning the moment into theater. I'll make this interesting. I bet she quits within a week. Anyone want to take the other side? He walks to the whiteboard near the time clock, picks up a blue marker, and writes in thick capital letters, Chen resignation pool. Underneath, week 1. His smile is the kind of smile that has ended careers quietly, in parking lots, in the privacy of annual reviews where HR keeps no records. Sarah stands motionless for 3 seconds. Long enough that someone in the room notices she isn't breathing. Long enough that the fluorescent lights overhead seem to hum louder, filling the silence like a held note on a violin string. Then she takes one measured breath. Just one. A tear escapes down her left cheek, not from anger, not from hurt, but from the sheer weight of restraint. She wipes it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. When she speaks, her voice is steady as a laser beam, each word carved with precision. "I've stopped bleeding. That won't stop, Dr. Hargrove. I can certainly handle this." The room goes absolutely silent. Nobody moves. Nobody breathes. Someone drops a pen and the sound echoes across tile like a gunshot. Hargrove's smile falters for exactly 1/4 of a second before he turns back to his coffee, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitches beneath his ear. Sarah sets the folder on the counter and walks out without another word, her spine straight, her hand steady, her presence somehow larger than it was before she spoke. But that wasn't the worst part. That was just the opening move in a game Hargrove was determined to win. The next day, the cafeteria during lunch rush. 200 people compressed into a space designed for half that many. The noise level sits at the threshold where you have to raise your voice to be heard, which means Sarah doesn't hear Hargrove approaching until his shoulder brushes her arm and her tray, the one she's been carrying for 3 steps from the hot line, crashes to the floor. Pasta spreads across the tile in a Jackson Pollock of marinara and broken dreams. 40 people turn. 40 people watch. Hargrove's hand flies to his mouth in exaggerated surprise, eyebrows raised like he's genuinely shocked by his own clumsiness. Oops. Clumsy me. He doesn't apologize. Doesn't offer to buy her another meal. Just leaves her there, kneeling on the floor, picking up shattered ceramic and letters while the lunch crowd steps around her like she's already become invisible. That afternoon, the hallway outside the nurse's station is empty except for her. Sarah is charting vitals when Hargrove appears from around the corner holding a patient chart. He doesn't speak. He simply releases it. The chart tumbles through the air in slow motion, papers spreading across the floor like a flock of white birds that have suddenly lost the ability to fly. 40 pages. Maybe 50. All numbered, all in sequence, all now scattered from the supply closet to the medication cabinet. He looks down at her from his full height, that smile returning, the one that says he's already calculated that she'll resign by Wednesday. Pick that up, sweetheart. The endearment lands like a slap because they both know it's meant to diminish, to reduce her from person to decoration, from professional to pretty thing that exists for his convenience. Sarah kneels slowly. No sudden movements. No rage vibrating through her body. She moves with the deliberate patience of someone who has done harder things in worse places, someone who understands that anger is a luxury only available to people with options. She picks up the first page. Then the second. Her hands are steady. Her breathing is even. There's no trembling, no white knuckles, no sign that this moment is causing her anything other than mild administrative inconvenience. A charge nurse watches from the medication window, whispers to a young intern, "I've never seen anyone take that much and not break." Sarah reassembles the chart page by page, organizing them back into numerical sequence with the precision of someone who understands that details matter, that control lives in the smallest gestures. When the last page is in her hands, she stands, walks toward Hargrove, and hands him the stack. Their eyes meet for exactly 1 second. In that second, Hargrove sees something that makes his pupils dilate slightly, some flicker of recognition that he's pushed the wrong person, that beneath the scrubs and the deference lives something he doesn't understand. Then the moment passes. Sarah walks away toward the patient rooms, and Hargrove is left holding the chart, his smile gone cold. 2 nights later, the appendectomy should be routine. A 43-year-old construction manager, 3-hour procedure, minimal complications expected, home by Friday with nothing but adhesions and a funny story about the time they found his appendix was actually a ticking time bomb of inflammation. But routine is what happens when the body cooperates, and this body decides to rebel. 30 minutes into closure, the patient's BP crashes. 98 systolic and plummeting. The monitor screams its alarm, not the gentle beep 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 of normal sinus rhythm but the urgent wail of a heart betraying its owner. Hargrove's hands freeze above the surgical field for exactly half a second. In trauma, half a second is an eternity. Sarah's hands move. Not because Hargrove told her to move, but because her body has trained responses to this precise sequence of vital sign degradation, because her muscle memory understands the mathematics of septic shock and bowel perforation before Hargrove's conscious mind catches up. Sepsis. Perforation. Her voice is calm, almost bored, the voice of someone diagnosing something they've diagnosed 100 times before. Bowel wall integrity compromised. She's already reaching for the suction, already opening the tray for extended exploration, already moving like she's reading a surgical timeline that only she can see. Hargrove shifts into action, his hands finally remembering what they're supposed to do, but he's following her tempo now, not leading it. She anticipates. She clamps. She applies pressure at the exact point that will minimize blood loss while maintaining visibility. The speed of it, the efficiency, the precision, it's not nursing technique. It's something else. It's the muscle memory of someone who has done this with explosions happening outside the tent, with air support inbound, with a ticking clock that measures in minutes before a life becomes a body. In the observation gallery above the surgical suite, an army medic named Torres watches through the glass. He's recovering from a femur fracture sustained during a training exercise, and he's at that stage where doctors have cleared him to sit up, to walk, to observe the outside world like he's already halfway back to being human. His wife sits beside him, knitting something blue that might be a baby blanket. Torres leans forward suddenly, his entire body going rigid. He whispers, barely breathing, "That's not nursing technique. That's combat surgery. I've seen it in Kandahar." His wife asks what he means, her needles pausing mid-stitch. The way she controls bleeding with minimal supplies. The pressure point efficiency. The speed. That's battlefield medicine. That's someone who's done this when the power could go out. He watches Sarah's hands, steady as a surgical laser, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, and something in his chest tightens. Torres has been to Sanjin. Torres has bled out on a hot landing zone and been brought back by someone who knew exactly where to cut and what to do when they got there. Torres recognizes the signature of survival training that transcends civilian medicine. Hargrove doesn't hear the comment. But he sees Torres staring. He sees the recognition crystallize across the medic's face like frost on a window. When Sarah glances up at the gallery and spots Torres, when she sees him watching her with the specific intensity of someone who understands what he's looking at, something flickers across her face, fear, maybe, or resignation, or the knowledge that a secret she's buried for 3 years just developed cracks. The mask drops back into place almost immediately. The hands keep moving. The procedure closes. The patient's vitals stabilize. By the time they're closing the abdomen, Sarah is invisible again, just another nurse doing her job, just another pair of hands in a sterile field that nobody will remember tomorrow. Hargrove remembers though. After the surgery, he pulls Torres's chart. Notes the military service, army medic, 3 tours, Bronze Star for Valor. Starts making phone calls to people he knows, people with military connections, old classmates who went into naval medical commands. Then he turns his attention to Sarah's file. Pulls her employment records with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for fraud investigations. Her nursing school transcripts list a college with the right name but wrong accreditation dates. Her references answer his calls, but they sound coached, like they've been rehearsed into consistency. Her social security number pings strangely in verification databases, returns results that don't quite align with her supposed background. Nothing before 3 years ago. No digital footprint. No social media. No apartment leases or car registrations or tax returns older than 36 months. A ghost with credentials that look real until you actually check them, and Hargrove has just started checking. 2 nights later, the appendectomy was supposed to be routine. Sarah stood on the patient's side of the OR table at Sacred Heart, her movements already synced to Dr. Hargrove's rhythms before his hands even approached the surgical field. The patient was a construction worker, 34, no complications listed in the chart. Standard laparoscopic approach. Standard recovery timeline. Nothing about the next 40 minutes would be standard. The first sign came when Hargrove opened the abdomen. His jaw tightened. The smell hit them all at once, not the clean copper of surgical blood, but something else. Something rotten. Bowel perforation. The appendix hadn't ruptured cleanly. It had perforated days ago, contaminating the peritoneal cavity with fecal matter. Septic shock was already building in the patient's system like a clock counting down. Suction, Hargrove said. Not a question. A command. Sarah was already moving, the suction catheter positioned before he finished the word. Her hands moved on their own, 7 years of training expressing itself through muscle memory developed in operating theaters that didn't have air conditioning or fluorescent lights or the luxury of predictable patients. Clamp. There. No, left side. She had the vascular clamp ready. His eyes flicked to hers once, just once, a fraction of a second where something registered, the way she anticipated his next move before he made it. The way her hand carried the certainty of someone who had done this under mortar fire. The next hour dissolved into the rhythm of crisis. Hargrove worked with precision, his technical skill undeniable, but Sarah's role transcended the normal boundaries of nursing assistance. When the infection had spread beyond containment, when the patient's core temperature began climbing and his white cell count would have been catastrophic if they'd had time to check it, Sarah was 3 steps ahead. Irrigation. Debridement. She prepared the antibiotic solution without being asked, knew the dilution, knew the temperature, knew the exact moment Hargrove would need the next instrument before he opened his hand. At one point, Hargrove paused, only for a second, uncertain about the extent of the contamination spreading toward the mesenteric artery. Sarah's voice came quiet but absolute, extend the incision. 5 mm cephalad. Not a suggestion. A course correction from someone who had assessed the anatomy and made a decision based on data only someone with advanced surgical training would even recognize. Hargrove's shoulders tensed. He didn't acknowledge the instruction. But he made the incision exactly where she indicated, and when he did, he saw what she'd already calculated, the infection beginning to track toward a major vessel. He'd missed it. This woman in scrubs, this night shift nurse with a clean employment record and mysterious blank spaces before 3 years ago, had spotted a surgical complication that his 22 years of medical school and fellowship training had nearly overlooked. His hand steadied. He worked without speaking, without looking at her again. But the anger was there now, simmering under the fluorescent lights like heat shimmer on asphalt. The intercom crackled above them, trauma incoming. ETA for minutes. Motorcycle versus truck on I-05. 2 patients. The charge nurse's voice carried the controlled urgency that meant serious injuries. But they were in the middle of a containment operation. They couldn't leave. Hargrove's jaw clenched. Get me whoever's available. Now. Sarah's hands never stopped moving. Gauze. Irrigation. The rhythm of saving a life that infection was trying to steal. The patient's heart rate climbed, not from blood loss, but from septic response. His core temp had hit 39.8 degrees. The fever was the body's catastrophic attempt to fight back against overwhelming bacterial load. At this point, antibiotics were just hope in a bottle. Surgical control of infection was the only real weapon. 43 minutes into the procedure, Hargrove closed the abdomen. The construction worker would survive, would spend the next week fighting infection, running fevers that would spike and drop, requiring a second surgery in 72 hours. But he would survive because Sarah's anticipation had prevented a cascade failure that would have been Hargrove's responsibility. As the surgical team transferred the patient to recovery, as nurses wheeled him toward the post-op unit where monitors would track his vital signs every 15 minutes, Sarah noticed the observation gallery emptying. One of the nurses was leaving. But another figure remained in the shadows above the OR, the army medic from post-op, the one recovering from his own surgery, the one who shouldn't have been standing at all. He was holding a phone. His wife stood beside him, one arm linked through his, both of them watching as Sarah removed her surgical mask and gloves with the mechanical precision of someone pulling off a uniform after a long deployment. The medic's mouth moved, barely audible through the speaker system still running audio from the gallery. That's not nursing technique. That's combat surgery. I've seen it in Kandahar. Field conditions, triage decisions, the way she reads the anatomy before the surgeon even looks at it. That's someone who's done this under fire. His wife's hand tightened on his arm. She whispered something. He shook his head, still watching Sarah. No. I'm telling you. Combat medic, maybe. Or trauma surgeon deployed. Doesn't matter what the badge says. What I just watched was someone trained by the military, in the military, for the military. Sarah didn't hear him. She was already moving toward the sink, already stripping off her surgical gown. But Hargrove heard. The attending physician heard. And in that moment, Hargrove stopped moving entirely, just stood there, hands dangling at his sides, realizing that the evidence had just accumulated another layer. This woman had performed surgical decision-making that belonged in an operating theater in Germany, not on the night shift at Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hargrove had already made phone calls. He'd already begun activating his network. He'd reached out to 3 board members the previous evening, dropped suggestions about suspicious credentials, mentioned gaps in her employment history that didn't add up. He'd done it confidently, the way men with 22 years of status did things, with the absolute certainty that his word would be trusted, that his suspicions would be treated as fact. He'd already found the inconsistency. Her social security number only existed for 36 months. An investigator hired that morning was running the numbers, comparing her claimed nursing certifications against the registry databases. Nothing matched perfectly. Everything was just slightly off, like someone had built an identity carefully, competently, but with the knowledge that it might not withstand close scrutiny. Hargrove had no idea what was actually happening. He had no idea that Sarah's records had been erased by people with the authority to make humans disappear from official documentation. He didn't know that the nursing licenses were real, the certifications legitimate, the entire identity painstakingly constructed by the same government entity that had buried her actual name and rank and service record. He just knew she didn't belong here, and he was going to prove it. Sarah finished her paperwork in the break room, hands still steady from the adrenaline, the surgical rhythm. She sat in the dim light near the coffee maker and allowed herself one breath, just one, where her shoulders dropped and her eyes closed. Through the small window, she could see the San Diego skyline, the lights of the city that had been her hiding place for 36 months, the only place where Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen could become invisible. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, investigation initiated pending identity verification. She stared at the message for 10 seconds, then deleted it. The phone rang 30 seconds later. She didn't recognize the area code. She didn't answer. But as she walked toward the parking lot, as the night air hit her skin with the smell of salt from the bay and diesel from the highway, she understood with the clarity that only comes from experience. Hargrove had started something. And unlike the appendectomy patient, unlike the situation she could control with her hands and her knowledge, this was something that would have to play out according to rules she no longer made. The rain started without warning, not the gentle drizzle San Diego usually saw, but heavy sheets that hammered against the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody had asked for. She walked toward her car, not bothering to run, letting the water soak through her scrubs. Behind her, through the hospital windows, she could see Hargrove on the phone in the doctor's lounge, gesturing with the kind of animated fury that meant he'd found something, or thought he had. She had maybe 72 hours before his investigation yielded results. 72 hours before the Department of Defense discovered that someone had activated her paper trail, that questions were being asked about a person who was supposed to remain permanently theoretical. Sarah Chen, night shift nurse, was about to stop existing. But first, she thought as she sat in her car watching the rain, first they're going to find out exactly who I was. The call came in at 2:27 a.m. Dispatch radio crackled through Sacred Heart's trauma bay, incoming, approximately 4 minutes. Male, 56, training accident at Camp Pendleton. Blunt chest trauma, decreased breath sounds left side, BP dropping. Possible pneumothorax progressing to tension physiology. Sarah heard it from the 3rd floor. She was restocking the surgical crash cart when the alert ran through the hospital's nervous system like electricity through copper wire. Her hands didn't pause. The 4 lines went back in their precise rows. The defibrillator pads stayed organized in their sealed packages. But something in her body had already shifted, muscle memory recognizing the rhythm of a man in trouble, the kind of trouble that doesn't wait for morning shift. She was in the elevator 30 seconds after the ambulance doors opened. The trauma team assembled like they always did, Dr. Hargrove barking orders he'd read in textbooks, 2 residents scrambling to keep up, a respiratory therapist already squeezing a bag valve mask. The stretcher rolled toward the OR with the controlled urgency of people who'd practiced this drill 100 times but never truly understood it. Colonel James Reeves, Green Beret, lay on that stretcher with his left chest caving inward like something had stolen his breath and left only the echo behind. His oxygen saturation was 68 and dropping. Sarah stepped into the elevator as the doors began to close. Hargrove didn't acknowledge her. In his hierarchy, night shift nurses were furniture, useful only if they stayed silent and out of the way. The resident fumbled with the oxygen mask. The colonel's eyes were starting to go glassy, the look of a man whose body was shutting down system by system, choosing what to keep and what to abandon in the fight for survival. Then his monitors went wild. The cardiac rhythm deteriorated into something between a heartbeat and a scream, pressure in the chest cavity crushing the heart, the lungs already collapsed, blood filling spaces where air should be. The colonel's body seized. His back arched. His lips turned the color of a winter sky. "He's crashing," someone said. The elevator was between floors. Hargrove spun toward the resident with his hand out. "Get the crash cart, we need to," but the resident was frozen, staring at the numbers on the monitor as if they might change if he watched them hard enough. The respiratory therapist was squeezing the bag with both hands now, pushing air into lungs that wouldn't accept it, pushing against a pressure that had nothing to do with respiration. Sarah moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't apologize for her presence. She reached across the colonel's body, her hands finding the landmarks the way a musician finds keys they've played 10,000 times, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the thin membrane that separated the outside world from the cavity where his heart was being crushed. Her fingers located the space between his ribs like she was reading Braille. Her hands moved on their own. The needle was in her palm before she'd finished the thought, 14-gauge angiocath, the kind kept in every trauma kit because sometimes you had to buy time measured in seconds. The kind she'd used in field hospitals where the only OR was the ground beneath your knees and the only anesthesia was the mercy of shock. She pushed the needle between the ribs. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. That terrible, beautiful, life-giving sound of pressure releasing from a space it had no right to occupy. The colonel's chest deflated slightly. The monitor's frantic screaming dropped to a rhythm that resembled something almost human. O2 sat, 71. 75. 82. "What the hell are you doing?" Hargrove's voice came from somewhere outside her focus. His voice sounded like it was coming through water. "Keeping him alive," Sarah said. Her voice was steady as surgical steel. She didn't look away from the colonel's chest, didn't look away from the needle she'd secured, didn't acknowledge Hargrove's existence. The colonel's color was returning. Not pink yet. Not normal. But not the color of someone actively dying either. 88. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor. The surgical team was waiting. They saw the colonel. They saw the needle in his chest performing its miracle. They saw the monitor reading numbers that meant survival instead of death. They didn't see who'd placed it. The stretcher moved toward the OR. Sarah stepped back into the corner of the elevator, her hands at her sides, her face composed the way a surgeon's face becomes composed when the procedure is complete and the outcome is no longer in their control. Hargrove stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. His jaw moved like he was chewing on words he hadn't decided whether to say. The elevator doors closed again. Hargrove didn't ride it down. He was already on his radio by the time Sarah reached the 2nd floor. She heard his voice amplified through Sacred Heart's internal network, loud enough that 3 different departments picked it up simultaneously. "Security to my office. Now." Then, like an afterthought that was no afterthought at all, "Also call the State Board. And the FBI. We have a problem." The problem was standing in a scrub cap, waiting for the other staff to arrive. Sarah finished her shift. She checked on post-op patients who were sleeping off anesthesia. She restocked supplies that had been used during the emergency. She moved through the hospital the way she'd moved through the night for 3 years, present but invisible, competent but unremarkable. The kind of nurse administrators hired and never thought about again. By 6 a.m., the sun was rising over San Diego in shades of orange and gold, and Dr. Hargrove was on the phone with the hospital's board chairman while the man was still eating his breakfast, the morning probably still peaceful, his wife probably still asleep beside him. "We have an unlicensed medical provider operating in our ICU," Hargrove said. His voice had the tone of a man who'd been awake since the moment the elevator doors opened. "She performed an emergency procedure without authorization. She's not even a real nurse." The board chairman's voice came back, muffled. "Who are we talking about?" "Sarah Chen. Night shift. And before you ask, yes, I'm already pulling everything. Every reference she listed, I have people calling them right now. Her nursing school transcript. Her credentials. I'm betting we find exactly nothing. But the thing about the internet is that it moves fast. The thing about investigators hired at 6 in the morning by hospital boards panicking about liability is that they work faster than most people realize. By noon, the investigator, a man named Holloway with the kind of eyes that had seen too many people lie to him, had already made his first discovery. Sarah Chen's social security number. It didn't exist before May 2020. Not a single credit card application. No prior address. No employment history. No college transcripts that could be verified. No nursing school in Nevada or California or any state where someone named Sarah Chen had supposedly graduated. She'd appeared in the records as fully formed as Athena from Zeus's head, complete with credentials and references, and then she'd simply done her job quietly for 3 years. She'd simply saved lives. Hargrove called everyone. He called board members during lunch. He called references who fumbled through their responses, who admitted they weren't entirely sure they'd ever actually met this Chen woman, who'd recommended her based on another person's recommendation, which traced back to someone else, which eventually dead-ended into nothing. He called the state board. He called the FBI field office in San Diego. He built a structure of evidence that was solid and damning and built entirely on the fact that Sarah Chen didn't officially exist before she arrived at Sacred Heart. What he didn't know was why. What he didn't know was that some people disappear because they're ordered to disappear. That some lives get erased not because of crime but because of the opposite, because of service so classified that even the people you saved aren't allowed to acknowledge you survived. That some nurses don't have employment histories because their previous employment was to an organization with no official name and no public acknowledgement and no record of anyone who worked there. The colonel in post-op was starting to remember things. Fragments at first. A voice in the darkness. Hands that knew exactly where to place a needle. A Navy corpsman in Sanjin who'd kept an entire A-team alive for 40 hours during a siege, who'd performed procedures in field hospitals that shouldn't have worked but did. Who wore a 3rd Special Forces group patch that matched the one the colonel had been wearing the day of the accident. By the time security found Sarah in the staff locker room, Hargrove had already prepared his announcement. The folder in his hands was thick with documentation. The evidence against her was circumstantial but overwhelming. The staff meeting convened at 3 p.m. in Sacred Heart's main conference room. 20 nurses. 10 doctors. Administrators in the back with their hands folded and their expressions carefully neutral. Hargrove opened by talking about patient safety. He talked about hospital liability. He talked about the responsibility of institutions to protect the public from fraud and deception. Then he laid it out, fabricated transcripts, references who couldn't verify anything, a social security number that appeared from nowhere in 2020, an emergency procedure performed in an elevator without authorization or training. "You're suspended effective immediately," Hargrove said, not looking at her. "And I'm reporting you to the State Board for Fraud and the FBI for identity theft. You'll never work in healthcare again." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Sarah's face didn't change. Not a tremor. Not a flush. Not even the small muscle twitch at her jaw that might have suggested she was clenching her teeth. She simply stood there in her scrubs, her badge clipped to her collar, her hands at her sides, and absorbed the words like she'd known they were coming. Like she'd prepared for this moment. One of the ER attendings started to speak, but Hargrove cut him off with a folder of evidence. Security walked her to her locker. She changed out of her scrubs slowly, deliberately, as if every movement mattered. The jacket she took from the back of the locker had a patch sewn inside the lining, faded now, colors bleeding into each other, but still recognizable if you knew what you were looking at. 3rd Special Forces Group. She folded it carefully and placed it in the cardboard box with her personal items. Her ID badge went on the desk. The security guard watched her leave without saying anything. Sarah walked out of Sacred Heart at 3:13 p.m. on a day when the sun was still high enough to hurt if you looked at it directly. The parking lot stretched in front of her like something that belonged to a different life. Her car was where she'd left it that morning. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. Her phone buzzed once. An unknown number. A text message in a format she hadn't seen in 3 years. A location. A name. A single word, cleared. Everything she'd buried was asking to surface. But that wasn't the worst part. The conference room at Sacred Heart went silent when Dr. Hargrove walked in, his face arranged into something that looked like regret but tasted like victory. 23 nursing staff. 3 administrators. 1 security officer stationed by the door like a reminder that this wasn't a conversation, it was an execution. He set a folder on the mahogany table. Crisp. Deliberate. "Sarah Chen," he said, and every head in the room swiveled toward the empty chair where she should have been sitting. "Has been terminated, effective immediately, for falsifying employment credentials and fraudulent misrepresentation of her qualifications." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were holding their breath. Hargrove's voice dropped lower, the kind of voice that makes people lean in even when they don't want to. "I filed reports with the California Board of Nursing for practicing medicine without a license. I've contacted the FBI regarding identity theft and the use of a social security number that cannot be verified through standard background screening." He paused. Let that sink in. She will never work in healthcare again. Not in California. Not anywhere her name is run through a database. He looked around the table, and something in his expression said he expected applause. What he got was the sound of someone's coffee cup scraping against the wooden table, nervous and loud. Torres, the army medic who'd watched the appendectomy from the observation gallery, opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it. He understood now, you didn't contradict doctors in rooms like this. Not unless you wanted your own credibility shredded. Hargrove dismissed them with a wave. "That's all," he said, and stood up like a man who'd just solved a problem everyone else had created. But that wasn't the worst part of what happened next. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital in Mission Valley, 40 minutes from Sacred Heart, holding a clipboard with intake forms that asked questions she couldn't answer. Reason for visit: anxiety, insomnia, recurring nightmares. Duration: chronic. Previous psychiatric care: none that she could list. The waiting room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, the same smell every VA facility in America shares, like they all ordered from the same supplier of despair. Young men in baseball caps sat beside her, some missing limbs, all missing something in the eyes. She'd seen that look before. She'd caused that look to disappear in field hospitals under mortar fire, and these veterans didn't recognize her face because she was the help, the invisible hands during crisis, never the person being thanked. A kid, couldn't have been more than 22, with a pronounced limp and the bearing of someone who'd earned it, looked at her and nodded the way soldiers nod at other soldiers when they see something familiar in the civilian world. She nodded back. Neither of them spoke. Some recognition doesn't need words. 40 minutes later, she was called back. The mental health intake would take 2 hours, and she had nowhere else to be now. No uniform. No badge. No night shift to pretend she was working toward something. Just a folder and a future that looked like waiting rooms and paperwork. Colonel James Reeves woke up fully for the first time since the training accident at 2300 hours on day 3 post-op, and the first thing he did was ask for the hospital's chief surgeon. His nurse, a woman named Rodriguez with 30 years of Sacred Heart laminated on her name badge, smiled and said she'd fetch Dr. Hargrove right away. But Colonel Reeves's son, Captain Michael Reeves, USMC, was sitting in the chair beside the bed, and he said, "Wait. Dad, what was the name?" His father's eyes were still soft from the anesthesia, but his voice was steady. "The nurse. The one who was there when I went down. Before the OR. I need to thank her." Captain Reeves leaned forward, scanning the discharge notes clipped to the end of the bed. And there, in the handwritten section where the pre-op nurse had documented the emergency treatment in the elevator, was a name. "Sarah Chen," he read aloud. His father's hand moved to his chest, to the faded patch sewn inside his jacket, the 3rd Special Forces Group insignia that had survived 3 wars and a training accident that shouldn't have been survived at all. "I know that name," Colonel Reeves whispered. "She was at Sanjin. The corpsman. She kept my entire squad alive during the siege. I thought she was killed in the pullout." Captain Reeves was already on his feet, moving toward the door. "Let me find her," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like someone had just told him a ghost was real. Sarah didn't recognize the room number when Rodriguez called her name 20 minutes later. She'd already filled out the intake forms at the VA, paid her copay from a checking account that had $300 in it, and committed to 8 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy that might help her sleep. The universe had a black sense of humor. Apparently it wanted her in hospitals after all, just not the way she'd planned. She stood up from the hard plastic chair in the psychiatric waiting room and followed Rodriguez out of the building, back into Sacred Heart, back into the place she'd been excised from. Colonel Reeves's room was on the surgical floor, East Wing, 3rd door on the left. Rodriguez had said something about family members requesting her specifically, which didn't make sense, but Sarah had learned that nothing made sense anymore. She knocked, opened the door, and froze. Colonel Reeves was sitting up, chest still bound tight from the pericardiocentesis she performed in the elevator, tubes running from his arm to 4 poles, and his eyes went wide the moment he saw her. But it wasn't shock at recognizing a nurse. It was the look of a man watching someone stand up from the dead. His hand went to his chest, to the jacket draped across the chair beside the bed, and he was staring at the faded patch, the 3rd Special Forces Group emblem, like it had just confirmed something impossible. "You," he said, and his voice cracked with something that wasn't pain. "You were at Sanjin." Captain Reeves stepped forward from where he'd been standing in the shadows by the window, and in his hands was a tablet, screen glowing with what looked like military documentation, the kind of official seal and redacted sections that meant classified. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen," he read, his voice tight. 3 tours. Naval Special Warfare Support. Medical. He looked up at her, and his eyes were shining. "You're her. You're actually her." A nurse Sarah had worked with for 6 months, Janet, a ICU specialist with a kind face and impossible schedule, was standing by the monitors, and she leaned in to read over Captain Reeves's shoulder. Her hand moved to her mouth. The tablet screen showed military citations, the kind of thing that didn't appear in normal personnel files. Janet's voice came out barely above a whisper, Bronze Star. She paused, reading. Silver Star. Another pause. 2 Navy Crosses. The tablet screen lit her face like a ghost light, and when she looked up at Sarah, she was trembling, actually trembling, her entire frame shaking like the wall between the two of them had just collapsed and she could suddenly see what was standing there. "And a Navy Cross," Janet whispered. "Two of them." The room was so quiet you could hear the heart monitor beeping its steady rhythm, could hear the 4-pump clicking, could hear the distant sound of a helicopter landing on the helipad 3 stories above. Sarah's hands were perfectly still at her sides. Her face was a mask. Her voice, when it came, was the same voice that had ordered men to move during surgeries, that had commanded respect in operating theaters under fire. "You need to sit back down, Captain. Your father's O2 sat is climbing, but his heart rate is elevated." "That's not what," Captain Reeves started, but then the door opened again. A man in full Navy dress white stood in the doorway. Behind him, a security detail in suits that looked like they'd been pressed by people who took that job seriously. The man stepped forward with the kind of bearing that made the air in the room feel different, denser, like the pressure had increased and everyone could feel their own weight suddenly. He walked past Colonel Reeves. Walked past Captain Reeves. Walked directly to Sarah and stood at parade rest, his hands rigid at his sides. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen," he said, and it wasn't a greeting. It was a recognition. His name tape read Commander Rourke. "I was ordered to bring you in for a debrief on Sanjin. But I'm here to tell you that operation's been declassified as of 0600 this morning. You've been cleared to exist again. Your protective status has been lifted, your records unsealed, and the Navy wants you back. Active duty. Immediate assignment. Master Chief pending." He paused. His voice dropped lower. "You don't have to hide anymore." Dr. Hargrove, who had arrived while Rourke was speaking, drawn by the commotion, expecting to find some issue with patient care, stood frozen in the doorway. His face went the color of old bone. He opened his mouth. Closed it. The security detail didn't even look at him. One of them turned slightly, and the look on that soldier's face was the kind of thing that made men reconsider their life choices. Sarah's jaw was tight, and for the first time in 3 days, something in her expression shifted, not a breaking, but a settling. Like a weight she'd been carrying alone had just been taken by someone with shoulders built for it. "What happened to the Sanjin intelligence?" she asked Commander Rourke, her voice even and precise. "Declassified 2 hours ago," Rourke said. "Pentagon wants the asset you saved for that CIA operation to go on record. They want your record on record. You saved a vital intelligence asset under fire in a war zone. You're a hero, Senior Chief. You always were. Now everyone gets to know it." Janet was crying silently, still holding the tablet, still reading the citations. Captain Reeves was holding his father's hand, and Colonel Reeves was staring at Sarah like she'd just walked out of a memory he'd been forced to carry alone for 3 years. The heart monitor was steady. The 4-pump was steady. Everything was steady except the moment itself, which felt like it might crack the building in half. 2 hours later, a security guard who'd handed Sarah her belongings box on the day she was fired approached Dr. Hargrove's office with an identical cardboard box. He knocked. Entered without waiting for an answer. Set the box on the desk with the sound of something final. "I believe you know the way out, sir," the guard said, and those were the only words anyone ever said to him about it. By evening, Hargrove's access badge had been deactivated. By morning, his termination letter had been delivered to his home address. By week's end, he'd submitted his resignation from Sacred Heart to avoid being fired for cause. By month's end, he was teaching CPR certification courses at San Diego Community College for $18 an hour, standing in front of bored students who checked their phones while he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy that received more dignity in its silence than he ever would again. But that's not where this ends. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes walking among us. Like if you believe in second chances. Comment below, have you ever been wrong about someone?